Oh, you swim in the ocean?
No, I swim in a club, but it has an outdoor pool here.
Oh, okay. So you get some UV that way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, I'd say let's just jump right into it then. Cool. Well, Brad Burkhart, thank you for taking the time to be on this podcast show. This is the 5th episode, and I'm just really honored to have someone who is as talented and just a master of their craft like you be on the show and have the chance to interview you. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah. The very first question that I wanted to kind of get into really was how you stumbled onto this medium in particular.
Well, it's very interesting. I like to say there's a lot of synchronicity in things that seem to happen, and I've tried to be alert to that in my life. But I originally majored in art and minored in physics at my undergraduate college, but I never did any work like this there. But during that time, I was doing these kind of pencil sketches, which are still the basis for these pieces, where I would just take a blank piece of paper and I would start just randomly drawing lines, and then these images would start emerging from the lines on the paper. And I did these for probably about, maybe 10, 15 years. And I just thought of them as maybe something personal. It wasn't really art, even though I studied art. And I originally thought I was going to go into architecture. I studied art as a major and minored in physics as an undergraduate. And I ended up at an architecture program in St. Louis at Washington University for a couple of years, but I found that I just really didn't click with the idea of working with what I would call dead materials, which is what architects work with. They work with, wood and metal and concrete and that sort of thing.
Right, yeah.
And also at that time, I had started doing these oil pastel paintings that were somewhat similar to my sketching. And I don't know how much you know about oil pastel, but it's a kind of a waxy crayon that you use, and it has a very tactile quality, which to me, it's very close to how expressionist painters would work in these expressionistic colors and stuff. So anyway, when I got discouraged with architecture, I decided I would move to San Francisco. And I ended up there for a couple of years, and I did actually, I think, one little show with these oil pastels. But after a while, I got interested in horticulture, and I actually got a secondary degree in horticulture in San Francisco. And then I later moved back to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I grew up, and went to landscape architecture school at the University of Michigan. Actually, I specialized in a type of landscape architecture that related to using native plants as a way to landscape. And my senior thesis there actually was a survey along interstate highway roadsides of naturally volunteering plants, and then I would try to come up with ways to use these naturally occurring plants to meet highway design standards.
Yeah.
So anyway, but then I left Ann Arbor because my second wife became a Waldorf school teacher, and she accepted the job as the first Waldorf school teacher in San Diego. And so I moved there. And while I was there, I met this Brazilian sculptor, Joyce Schleniger, who had recently moved to Encinitas, north of San Diego. And we got to talking about these sketches I was doing, and she encouraged me to translate them into some kind of ceramic format. And that's the original inspiration came from Joyce. And then the question was, what kind of format? And when I had been an undergraduate I went to this small liberal arts college called Kalamazoo College. I had studied in France for about 6 months as part of a foreign study program. And one of my, there were two things that happened there that were influential in how this work got started. First of all, when I was in the Université there at Université de Clermont-Ferrand in south central France near Vichy, I had a fairly good facility with French, and I was allowed to read books in French. And I actually took this course where I read this book called The History of the Renaissance, Histoire de la Renaissance. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, it was written by a Swiss gentleman called Jakob Burkhart, which is also my name. So, and I didn't realize it at the time, but Jakob Burkhart had written this book, and it was the first time the name Renaissance had ever been used before. Well, anyway, it turned out in my program there was just about 18 people, I think, in Clermont-Ferrand there. One of my classmates had developed an expertise in Renaissance artwork. And so she and I took off at Christmas time, and we went down to Italy, and we visited Florence and Assisi and Siena. And I was very impressed by the artwork at that time. And I'm not sure if everybody's aware of this, but that was a real break point in the development of consciousness, because we were moving from a period of more spiritually based and inspired art that the church paid for into a period which became more scientifically oriented up until the present, where basically we're looking more and more through a scientific view of the world. And it kind of began in Florence, and it was originally, the change took place when commercial guilds began to sponsor and pay for artwork instead of the church. And in front of the main cathedral in downtown Florence is a little octagonal building called the Baptistery. It's a baptismal building, and it has 4 sets of doors that are about 10 feet high and about 8 feet wide, 2 on each side. And during the Renaissance, these guilds paid for bronze relief panels that covered these doors. There's 10 to 20 on any given door, but what was interesting about them is that they represented the sort of stylistic changes through the Renaissance, beginning with the early Renaissance Giotto kind of artistic work, and then moving around till we get to Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci period at the end of the Renaissance. And the last and greatest competition for the doors was won by a man named Ghiberti, and it took him about 25 years to do these 10 panels. And I had been very inspired by these when I'd seen them. And so when I started thinking about translating my sketches into some kind of sculptural format, I decided it seemed like a natural transition to go from a sketch, which is very two-dimensional, to a three-dimensional, yet kind of a sketch on a piece of clay, which is what I do, I think, in a way. So the format for my works are these rectangular slabs that I translate the sketches onto. Mm-hmm. And I have to make decisions about what comes forward, what goes backward. It's actually a pretty unusual artistic format. There aren't very many people who work in this format.
Yeah.
And particularly modern artists, I see very few. So I decided, after talking with my friend Joyce, that I was going to do, I just made this kind of affirmation. I was going to do, 20 of these, mm-hmm. and then exhibit them and see what happened. And at the time I started, I was only doing them half the size of these original panels. These are about 19 by 14, but the original ones were half this size. And of course, I had never worked in this medium before, and I didn't really know much about what I was doing. But the way it got started was I carried this idea around for, and again, synchronicity's playing a role here, for a couple of years, not knowing how I was going to actually execute the idea. I had no technical expertise in this kind of clay or the finishes or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And then one night after an art opening in San Diego, I met this gentleman walking back to my car. We were both looking in the same window. I think it was electrical fixtures or something. And I started, I don't know how we got to talking about this project. And then I said, well, but I know I'm going to do it, but I just don't know how I'm going to do it. And he reached over, put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, I know all the answers. And he did. He told me what kind of clay to use. He told me what kind of finishes to use. He worked in a place called Clay Associates in San Diego, which it turned out had this kiln that I fired in until I moved up here to Santa Cruz about 10 years ago. That was the only kiln of its kind in San Diego, if you can believe that. It's a fiberglass line gas-fired kiln. And the finishes on the pieces come from an iron oxide, which they're fired in what's called a reduction kiln, where air is taken out at a certain point, and it causes the iron to change color to this darker color. And over the years, I've experimented more and more with things, and I've gotten better at getting darkers and lighters in the pieces. But originally,
before we actually get into the actual technicalities of the process, sure. I want to kind of give more of a backstory on you and your really the overarching theme of your work.
Sure.
So I wanted to actually read a statement that's from your bio.
Okay.
That's kind of covered. I'll kind of say something about that after, but it just goes, you say, I feel passionate about creating art that reconnects individuals and groups with a universal quality of intuitive understanding. Fostering this experience is the mission I am most committed to in my art, and I offer my sculptures as a source of renewal for our shared culture. And you had a list of people that kind of in your website that I saw reoccurring, and then from hanging out with you this morning and yesterday, like people like Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung and people like that who really emphasize mythology and archetypes. Mm-hmm. Seems like a very strong theme in your work that you're also trying to like share with the world. And so I'm just curious for you, the aspect of reintegrating intuition as being a key part of your work. Mm-hmm. What is intuition to you?
Well, I've thought about this quite a bit, and I think in some ways we don't often have the language to describe it in our modern culture. Okay. And the reason for that is that ever since the Renaissance, the way we judge what's real in the world has to do with scientific evidence, objective evidence. And so intuition has been somewhat sidelined since that point. And I would say it's a kind of a magical process that we as human beings have that allows us to come up with ideas, images, and even solutions to problems from some place that we don't know where they're coming from. For example, some scientists work along these lines. The original discovery of the structure of DNA was dreamt in a dream by Mr. Crick and his associate who came up with the structure. But ever since the Renaissance, this function of intuition, which was traditionally associated with shamans in older tribes, there would be people who would have these they would be raised as shamans. They had visions. They saw things that other people maybe didn't see. So in a way, it's a talent as well. It's like some people have it better than others. And since the Renaissance, that there's been a tendency to want to marginalize it as a way to know the world. And so what happens is we divide and conquer. So the intuitive function has been divided up between priests and psychologists and artists since the Renaissance. Each have their own little area. And what's interesting about it is, like, let's just take psychology for an example. Jungian psychology is based more on intuitive insight. Freudian psychology is a little more objectively based, scientific. And so what happens is that Freudian psychology has gotten to be more thought to be more truthful than Jungian psychology is. And so Jungians have been somewhat marginalized. And even in art, what we've developed, what I call a sort of a pseudo-scientific language where line, color, form, composition, and so most people think you've got to have a doctoral degree in art to make a judgment about it. They have no way to grasp the intuitive or maybe more emotional relationship with the art. In fact, one of the reasons I was in San Diego, and I think where the art got started originally, was that there is a real divide between Northern American countries and South American countries, and the South American countries are the more heart-based countries, and the northern ones that we live in here are more head-based or scientifically based. And where those cultures come together is right at the border, and San Diego is one of the key places where they cross over. And so I've actually had some of my work exhibited in both places. But anyway, to get back to the intuitive idea, I've had to struggle a little bit with where that comes from. People will look at my work. I used to have a little gallery in San Diego, and they'd come in, and I'd have them look out the window and say, "Oh, well, that's what you think the real world is." And and then I'd say, "Well, okay, so where are all these images coming from?" Because what's so fascinating about my work to me is, I'm sure you've all seen artists who have a certain style, like, Picasso has his blue boy style or whatever, but there's no images that repeat in my work, almost none.
In terms of content.
Yeah, they're all different. And some of them are more fantastical than others, perhaps. And I don't dream them. In fact, for many years, I was fascinated by dreaming. I used to keep dream journals, and I was fascinated by where dreams came from. And I read this article, which I think has kind of convinced me about dreaming, which was an article that there's only human beings and one other animal, I think they're lemurs, who have a different consciousness when they sleep than when they're awake, where they can dream.
Lemurs.
Yeah, and the theory is, and I think there's a lot of validity in this, is that what happened with human beings is we kept growing and our heads got a lot bigger and bigger, but there came a point where we can't get a bigger head, or our body won't hold us up anymore. And so the theory is that the brain was able to accommodate additional processing by basically going into processing at night. So what we do when we dream is these problems that come up during the day come up in our sleep, and we often resolve them through dreaming. But that's not what my work's about. And so that's what is so interesting to me, and why I got less interested in dreaming, because where my work seems to be coming from is some deeper source of insight. And it's something that we as modern people are somewhat cut off from. I like to say we have these kind of goggles on that we can't see certain things. So anyway, I hope that gives you some idea of what I'm talking about. I'm not always... and also, we can maybe talk more about the verite, the truth in intuitive insight. Because a lot of times intuitions are not true. They can actually create great evil in the world. I think I mentioned to you yesterday, Hitler had the intuitive idea of the Aryan superiority, which look at what happened there, right?
Yeah.
So I was like thinking for years, well, how do you distinguish something that is true from, might apply to our real world the way science does, from intuition? How do you sort that out?
Right. Yeah, that's a big issue that I've always had. I don't want to say issue, but just kind of dilemma I've had with intuition as an idea, because it seems like if it were truly like a valid way of sourcing knowledge, that there would be an issue of the same situation with coincidence. I don't really know in the case of when something happens, whether it's a synchronicity or whether it's a coincidence, whether it's something that's truly a sign or it's just, oh no, the peanut butter just fell over because of gravity. And so, just random things like that. Like, but going back specifically to intuition, like you were saying, that's a really good example of like Hitler truly felt in his heart of hearts that what he was doing was right.
Yeah, and he was an artist actually. He did art. I don't know if you knew that, but well, anyway. So what came up for me after a lot of thinking was the Native American practice of vision questing, where the young braves are each year come in before they're allowed to be the adult members of the tribe, and they're sent out into the wilderness to live basically off the land by themselves for a month or more, and get a vision. All right, and then they're brought back to the circle of chiefs who run the tribe, and they're asked if they got a vision, and if they did, it's like, okay, you're a man now, you can go, and the next one, and the next one, and that's kind of what we know, what most people know about vision questing. But what I was interested in is what happened to these visions after they were presented to the leaders who were going to make the decisions for the tribe in the coming year. And what happened is that they would sit around and they would parse through the different visions, and they would say, oh, well, this is just based on some personal prejudice of that tribal member or whatever. And then other ones, they'd say, oh, this is a great idea for us to do this next year. And when they would come together in a consensus, they would create a practice for the tribe for the coming year out of the best visions. Okay. And so this began to change my idea of the artist as well, because I was talking earlier about intuition. I think some people have better intuitive insight than others. It's a bit of a gift. Okay. Not everybody has it in spades, but artists, to a certain extent, priests and psychologists have it. And what I began to realize is that in the 20th century, artists had kind of reversed the relationship with their audience. They were the ones who were in the know, and it was up to you to figure out what they were doing, and then you knew they were great. Okay? And in fact, one book written by Susie Gablik influenced me a lot in getting that clear. It's called Has Modernism Failed? And I won't go into detail about that. But the main thing was that when I discovered this relationship through the vision questing with the intuition, I realized that the artist has a gift, but in order for it to benefit society that they live in, they have an obligation to share it with society. And in fact, what's so interesting now is so many people do art and they're like, I just do it for myself. Okay? Well, I think that's a shame. I think it's actually morally irresponsible. And so, but the question that the artist has to deal with is what I've created worthwhile? Can it make a difference in the world? Okay, and going back to the vision quest, sometimes I'll hit it on the head, and other times, hey, just something that isn't helpful. So how do we decide what's good art and bad art, or what's useful art for society and what maybe isn't? We have to, as artists, put it out there, share it, and the more people it connects with, the more important it is. And I like to use Picasso's Guernica painting as an example of that, because I think it's one of his greatest paintings. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a portrayal of a traumatic bombing and destruction of a village in the Spanish Civil War. Mm-hmm. And although it's in a modern Cubist style, you can take this painting and put it in just about any culture, modern or ancient in the world, and people get it. And that's why it's a great painting. Yeah. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say on that. So I'm sure you have more questions, but it's the idea that the artist has a gift to share, and then it can come up sometimes, like intuition does, with these really, really unimaginable solutions that science can't figure out on its own.
Yeah.
And I think we're facing that more and more now in this era where science has got us a lot. Like, we don't have to worry where our food's coming from and stuff, but we're missing something here.
Yeah. Well, that connects to what your book that you shared with me that you really found a lot of inspiration and connected with, the art and physics book. But let's just shelf that for later, because that's such a big thing to talk about. I want to talk about specifically the community aspect, which seems like it really make you stand out as an artist, because I don't think I've never come across an artist that emphasizes community, not just as like not a theme of the work, but actually you take it a step further with like community is an important part of sharing your work. And that was kind of showcased yesterday when you had like a dozen or so people here, and there was the naming process going on, which is going to be a separate video that we release. But the naming process is unique because, like you were just saying, it's really pushing for an objective, collective understanding of what an artwork is, and that goes against the conceptual art of, like, the art you were saying earlier, the artist being like, well, I'm just going to make it and you figure it out because it's your job to figure out the meaning. And there's kind of this subjective openness to interpretation. You seem like you're against that, and you want objective, mutually agreed upon understanding. I'm curious, why is that important for you?
Well, it's kind of interesting how I got into that naming process, and I did talk about it a little yesterday when we were in the middle of it. But we've been taught, as I said, pretty much that art is a subjective experience, that you have your opinion, I have mine, particularly with art. You know, it's like, well, it's okay to differ because it's just subjective, right? Yeah. Well, so I'd always believed that, but then I also realized that, and maybe it's a generational thing for me, but a lot of the people, young people in my generation, they were all out to try to find community in different ways, all right? And I was always curious why that was such a strong, motivation for a lot of us. And what I noticed was that with this idea that art is a subjective experience, that we agree to disagree. And so tolerance is one of our highest moral values in these times. But as I thought about it, I realized that tolerance, the dark side of tolerance, was loneliness. Because I'll tolerate you, but I'll never understand you. You'll tolerate me, but you'll never understand me. Yeah. So we're sitting at it, we're in this vacuum where we want to connect, but we can't connect. Well, I stumbled on this naming process kind of by accident about 20 years ago, where I realized that if I got a groups of people together and we discussed the images in one of my works long enough, that we could reach consensus agreement on what was in it and come up with a story that was in the piece. And like I say, I don't dream these, and I don't know what the images are about when I sketch them, but there is a story in each of these pieces. And so I used to try to name the piece based on the story, and then I discovered that, well, I had an exhibit in Tijuana, Mexico a number of years ago, and I put a naming box up, and I asked people to put name in for this piece. Mm-hmm. And when I came back, really not knowing what I would find, there was about 70% of the people had all put the same name in the box.
Yeah.
Well, that's counterintuitive, right? So anyway, then I started doing these naming groups, and the same thing would happen after we would talk long enough and engage long enough. There would be this agreement to agree, not agreement to disagree. Mm-hmm. And what would happen, what I like to stand back and kind of notice what happens when people interact with my work. And I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But one of the things I noticed was that when we would get to the story, there would be this connection between everybody. Sometimes you'd even have these little prickles would run up your arm. It's like, wow, that's right. That's the name, you know? Yeah. So that's what drew me to this process. And again, it goes back to the Native American vision quest of finding the common ground in the visions that are out there, and then seeing whether they're useful in the world. And the more they speak to the people who are involved with the stories, the more they are useful, is kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah. Yeah. This kind of connects with what you were just saying with you not really always knowing where the content of your work is coming from, and it seems like automatic sketching is a big aspect of step one for you. And I'm just learning about automatic sketching actually from you and doing research for this interview, and it reminds me a lot of like stream of consciousness for writers, where you just kind of go and start. Can you walk me through that creative process?
It's kind of an interesting process in a couple of ways. First, I think there is a bit of artistic training that goes into recognition of images and as I said, talent and stuff. So when you start sketching, certain things will start appearing to you, and then you might refine them into like, I've studied anatomy and sketched nude, models and stuff. Yeah. So I know how to make muscles and stuff like that. So that process of sketching, you can you're led, but with talents you already have to a certain extent. The other thing that I've noticed about it, which I didn't in the beginning, is that it can be affected by intent and circumstance to a certain extent. And what I mean by that is a number of years ago, I was trying to start a business and it wasn't going very well, and my wife told me to get out of town and go to Paris. And so I went to Paris, and I would go and see modern artwork during the day, and then I would sketch in the afternoon. And when I got back, I had a series of pieces that I did, and I couldn't kind of figure out what they were about. And then I have this one piece, and it has a dog in it. And there's almost this kind of a language that's on the ground, and there's these trees at these different angles in the piece. And I don't know if you know about Fauvism. It was a modern art movement around the time of Impressionism, and it was on the verge of Expressionism, and there were a lot of kind of stronger emotional colors that were used in it, and a lot of times the trees would be at these weird angles because it gave a more emotional quality to the piece and stuff. And but they never did animals. There were no Fauva sculptors as far as I'm aware. But anyway, I'm looking at this piece, and it suddenly hit me that if there had been a Fauva sculptor, he would have done this piece. And so the name of the piece is Bark of the Fauva's Dog. But anyway, the reason I'm talking about that is there are other pieces in this series of sketches that seemed to reflect, in some ways, the spirit of different modern art movements that I had been viewing during the day. Mm. The other kind of thing that I found is that I did a project about a little over 10 years ago, called the Rosecrans Project, and I've been very interested in how intuitive insight might solve seemingly scientifically unsolvable problems. Racial prejudice, war, we do all this research on it, but we still got it, right? So I got involved in a project, which I won't go into a lot of detail here, but it basically centered on the idea that I would go to this cemetery where soldiers had died in all the wars that we had fought, and I would sit on the graves of soldiers who had died in these wars and ask the dead soldiers, how do we get past war, and see what happened, and sketch. Mm. So I did this for over a 6-month period, and then there were about 12 or 14 sculptures that came out of this series. And so that was an instance where the sketching was actually directed to try to address a problem. And so anyway, I've seen both sides of that in terms of, how the sketching goes. But normally when I sit down, I just start drawing. And a lot of times my sense is that there are undercurrents in our lives, in our society that, like I say, we're not paying attention to. Okay, because we can't see them a lot of the time, and
undercurrents as in subconscious activity, or
I guess they're subconscious, yeah. Okay. But when I start to sketch, they come out.
They come out,
and sometimes they are not just coming out of me. Like I had a series a couple of years ago that had a bunch of angels in it. And at the time, there were a lot of artists who were drawing angels. Mm-hmm. I think it was connected.
Okay.
I can't explain directly, but I do think that I've often thought of this idea, which I thought would be kind of interesting, to get a problem like, peace in the Middle East or something, and get a bunch of artists to go over there and dwell on this idea and create art. Yeah. With that in their mind, and then have some kind of exhibit of the work and ask the question, does it offer solutions here that nobody seems to have? You see what I'm saying?
They do.
So anyway, that's kind of where my thinking has gone with this.
Yeah. You touched on something there, the Rosecrans Project,
right,
which is one of your bigger projects that I definitely want to get into. I'm just curious before we move forward, though. You say how you're striving for objective meaning with each of your pieces, collective objective meaning. Mm-hmm. Are there any specific emotions or feelings that you try to capture with your work on a consistent basis, or is it each new work is its own kind of, it could be anything?
I think it's pretty much anything.
Yeah.
It was interesting when I first started showing my work. Mm-hmm. I didn't know what to expect, and I had a little gallery, and I had some stuff up on the wall, and people would walk in off the street, and sometimes people would get very upset. Mm-hmm. And there was some nudity in some of the work, but it wasn't really sexually based. And so I kept asking myself, why are these people so offended? Okay? And what I finally noticed was that it seemed like the majority of people who were most offended, not everyone, were white men. And so I asked myself, what do they have in common? And I realized, well, they're the wealthiest people in our society. They hold most of the power. They control most of the government. Mm. And then I asked myself, well, how do they get there? And what I realized was that in order to do that, they were having to bury their inner life. And so what was happening was that my work was dealing with this inner life. And when they would see it, they would be sickened by looking at it. And again, it wasn't just men. It's anyone who didn't really want to look at that side of that thing that we don't want to look at because we got these blinders on. So anyway, that I'm just sharing a little bit about that. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question exactly.
No, it's okay. That kind of, I mean, you touched on it briefly, that it's each new work is kind of its own, you're open to anything kind of happening.
Yeah,
and
I don't really
that.
know what's going to come. I actually am fascinated, to tell you the truth. That's one of the things I find most fascinating about the naming groups is, in fact, sometimes people will tell me things. I have images in some of my works that I don't know anything about, and they'll walk up to me and say, "Oh, well, such and so." I have this one piece. It has this guy. He has a cane, and it's called Modern Day Shaman, I think. And it has on the end of the cane a rat.
Right.
And I didn't have any idea what that was. And I met this guy at one of my openings, and he was a recently inaugurated Tibetan Buddhist monk. And I said, "Michael, do you know anything about this cane with the rat on?" He said, "Oh yeah, there's this whole sect in India, and they worship rats, and the temples are full of rats, and they all have these canes with the rats on them."
Yeah. So these are just unexplainable situations where you create a work of art, and then you showcase that work of art to the public, and you don't know exactly where the content of that came, but then someone who has either an education or a background in that ancient mythology or religion will point out the theme or the story that came from.
To a certain extent, that's not true for all pieces, but
Not
for
all
some
pieces.
of them.
Okay.
I had, in my early work, I had a bunch of matriarchal cultural images, which I didn't know a lot about at the time, and I later learned were part of my work. But it's interesting because Jung had this idea that we had connections with prior generations we had lived and stuff like that. I think he even called it kind of racial memory or something like that. And I think we as modern people are just taught not to look in that direction, but I feel there's something there. I can't quite explain it, but I once went with an archaeologist professor friend of mine in San Diego to this site on the other side of the Mexican border from San Diego called La Rumarosa, which is an old Native American sacred site. And they have these large boulders with petroglyphic paintings underneath. And I sketched there. And when I got back, I did this piece, and I couldn't figure out what it was about. And I realized that to a certain extent, as a person of modern consciousness, I could have been risking my life going to this place. It could have been quite dangerous to me. And so the piece is named "Entering Where Angels Fear to Tread."
Oh, I think I have that.
And it's because angels are a Christian creation, and so we tend to view these older pagan cultures through the Christian perspective because we live in kind of a Christian-based culture.
Yeah, no, I'm looking through the different works of art that you mentioned in your online presentation right now, of the Phrygian Journey and the one you just mentioned earlier, the one with the rat on the stick.
Yeah.
And Passing of the New World Light,
Right.
the God of the Haitians. Like all of these artworks that you've created that just have content that you didn't necessarily consciously have any understanding
Passing
of.
of the New World Light was interesting. I had this piece I did, and there was a group of people who came in my gallery down in San Diego, and they were working with the Museum of Man down there to put on a Haitian art exhibit, which I didn't know when they walked in, and they were like, well, how do you know about this guy here? And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, what guy? And he said, well, that's one of the main deities of the Haitians. And I'm like, oh, well, could you tell me about him? Because I don't know anything about him, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. That's something also I wanted to get your thoughts on more, because you mentioned briefly how people react. Some people react negatively, and then some people just react like I noticed that they'll point something out that you weren't even aware of.
Well, there's one additional thing that I've noticed about this work, which is actually, to my mind, the best part of it. And that is that people who interact with this work, and particularly people who buy it and put it in their spaces where they live or work, it somehow enhances their creativity. And I don't even understand how it works, but I had a project that I did in San Diego called the Poetry Project, where I had about 20 poets who picked works of mine of their choice and wrote poems inspired by them. And, then later we did a show, and then some of them moved out of town, and like I'd get calls like 10 years later, and some poet would call me up and say, is it okay if I do this poet in my new chapbook, because my editor's saying this is one of the best I ever wrote. And I'm not a poet, so I'm not a judge of that. But I had another woman who was an environmental consultant who owns a couple of my pieces, and she wrote a novel and published it and named it after the piece.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And one of the most interesting stories was this show I did in Santa Barbara, and it was in a Unitarian church. And when I came to take the show down, very few people had come to it. There was a young lady there, and she said, are you the artist? I said, yeah. And she said, well, I'm a member of this church, and this is in the social hall at the church. And she says, I'm really, really shy. And she said, I've never been able to be in this space before you hung your artwork there. I couldn't believe that my art could do that for somebody.
Yeah.
And then she later bought one of the pieces, even though I don't know where she got the money. She was unemployed at the time.
Yeah.
And went back and became an artist.
She herself became an artist?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So I'm just saying, I've noticed that the work, if people engage with it, really juices them up to another level of whatever creativity they already have.
Yeah. Maybe doing some Jungian therapy subconsciously without them even putting it into words, maybe.
Well, in a way, it's kind of interesting you mentioned Jungian therapy, because that exhibit at the church that I was just telling you about was specifically set up to be next to a Jungian conference that was going on, that was in Santa Barbara, and and nobody came. And I found myself wondering why that would be, because I thought Jungian people of all persuasions would be most interested in. See, I believe what I'm working in is what are called modern archetypes. Okay? But what I realized is, and we talked about this sort of marginalization of intuitive, fields, is that when groups of people get marginalized in society, they often dig in and they get real rigid in their beliefs. And I may be wrong about this, but it's been my observation that people who are Jungians only believe the only archetypes are the ones Jung came up with. They can't see that what I'm doing is not that different from where he was coming from.
You're just creating different archetypes.
I'm creating modern archetypes, not the ones he created in his time. You see, they only see the archetypes as the ones he came up with, because they want to hold to their beliefs, because they're being challenged all around by society to say, oh, Jung didn't know what he was talking about.
Yeah.
He wasn't scientific.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying?
And for those, just because I know you know so much more about this, just from looking at your library of books on psychology and specifically a lot of Jung, can you just briefly summarize like what Jungian archetypes are exactly and why they were so significant?
Well, I'm not a 100% conversant in that sort of thing, but Jung had the idea that we had certain parts of ourselves that were archetypal in a sense that, like Joseph Campbell was very involved with a lot of Jungian work, and there are certain stories that go with these archetypes. Like I think one of Joseph Campbell's books is A Hero of a Thousand Faces or something like that, where there's a journey of the hero.
Yeah.
And it's lived out in a certain way. And even though when we tell the old stories, we're not going to live the way the Greeks did, a young man like yourself would still have a journey that he could follow and be inspired by this original idea of the journey of developing the self and seeing the self. And also there's other ideas that Jung had about how we all have both feminine and masculine aspects, and sometimes we try to push some of those aspects down. We have shadow selves. That we don't always want to look at. But if we do look at them, we can develop our consciousness of the world in a broader way and sort of open the glasses up, so to speak.
I think we should get into the Rosecrans, some of the more the projects that you did.
Sure.
Specifically those two, but let's start with the Rosecrans.
Okay.
I explored your website and I explored your journal entries that you had there of your experience there. 6 months of going. Real quick, I do have something else I want to say, but real quick, was it every day that you were going?
No, I would usually go once a week because I had a regular job I was working while I was doing this project.
Okay.
And so I would go mainly on the weekends to this cemetery. It's on a peninsula of land that runs out on one side of San Diego Bay. Okay. And on one side is the San Diego Bay, which I don't know if you knew, but it was the largest military depot on the West Coast during World War II. And there's still a military base there with a lot of ships and stuff, fighter ships. And on the other side's the ocean. And then there's about 40,000 graves of soldiers who've been buried from. It's a federal cemetery for soldiers who died in wars. Every war and it turns out there are soldiers buried there from just about every war that we've fought, all the way back to, I don't know, like the Civil War and stuff like that.
And you were going to the cemetery. You were literally like sitting by the graves of fallen soldiers and doing your creative process, the very first step of your creative process with the automatic sketching. What happened? Because I know you said you had to stop at some point because it was just so much energy that you were experiencing.
It was a very interesting project. It originally got started with a naming session in the fall of 2002, and this was just before the United States got into the war in Iraq. And we had this naming session, and the name that came up for this piece was The Passing of the Warrior Class. And I couldn't figure out why that name would have come up in this naming session, but then I started to think on a little broader level, and I realized this was just before we went into this war in Iraq. And if you remember, there were all these protests going on all over the place. Australia, France, India, don't go into this war. We did eventually, of course, but I thought at that time maybe humanity is getting to some point where they're going to no longer feel that war is a way to solve human problems. And I had been interested in this idea of using my artwork to address some of these seemingly insoluble problems for a while. And so I don't know how I originally came up with this, but I came up with the idea that I was going to go out to this cemetery, which had all the, and I was not in the Army. I was basically, I never served in Vietnam because I was had a minor medical disqualification, and I also was in jail a number of times because when I didn't get into the military, I actually had planned on going to prison. I was a conscientious objector, And when I didn't get drafted, I went to work for a group called the Committee for Nonviolent Action on the East Coast, which did nonviolent protests against the war. And several times I was thrown in jail during that time. Anyway, I'm getting distracted on that. We were talking about, remind me again?
The Rosecrans Project.
Oh, yeah. So I didn't have a military experience, but I started going to the cemetery, and the idea was to find the graves of soldiers who had died, not just fought, because you can even have your wife buried there if you fought in a war with you, right? And I was having trouble. I started at the beginning of 2003. We hadn't yet entered the war yet. We didn't enter until March. And I would go out there, and they had a registry, but it didn't really say whether somebody had died, just whether they were buried there. And there was some iconography like KIA for more modern wars, which means killed in action, on the gravestones. But for older wars, no. And so I was getting kind of frustrated with the project at that point. And then I was driving around in my truck one day, and again, we're talking about intuition here, and I read in the paper that one of the first 7 people who had died in Iraq had just been buried there. His name was Matthew Mark Kennedy, interesting name, who had been a valedictorian graduate of one of the local high schools. And I thought, time to put up or shut up, Brad. I turned my truck around and I said, I'm going to find this guy's grave. Well,
intuitively.
It was a little intuitively, and it was a bit of an absurd notion in a sense, because the cemetery was nearly full by then. It's since closed, actually, because there weren't any grave sites left. And so they were, in like World War I, they'd all be in one section, or World War II, but now there was just here and there. They had a few spots left, and so there was no rhyme or reason where they were putting these graves. And so I just drove out there and drove right to this guy's grave. There wasn't even any grass growing on it yet. And that's how I started finding the graves after that.
Yeah.
And then all these weird things started happening to me in this cemetery, and I thought, this is too weird. Nobody's going to believe this. So then I started keeping this journal, which is what's on my Rosecrans blog now. And these strange things would happen to me. Usually there was nobody in the cemetery because it was a weekend and people just weren't there. But one weekend I was going to find the Korean War dead, and I was trying to get near these graves, and I kept getting, at first I got hit on the back of the head by this sharp object, and I thought, oh, it must be some kids are throwing rocks at me or something.
You actually physically got hit?
I got hit on the back of my head, all right? And I'm like, well, what was that, you know? And I'm looking around, and there's nobody in the cemetery, and I thought, must be some kids are pranking me or something, you know? So I just keep walking, and bam, another one. And then I finally realized I was being attacked by this hawk, this warbird, who would not let me get near these Korean War dead that day. I had to go back to my car that day to sketch.
It was pooping on you, or?
No, it was scratching the back of my head with its claws.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Just nicking me, you know.
It would swoop down and nick you?
Nick the back of my head.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Weird, right?
Weird. Yeah.
So that's just one of the things. And then as time went on, I also realized that I didn't realize what sitting with the dead was going to do to me psychologically. I just never thought about it before. And actually things started to get I started to get a little depressed after a while. And finally I said to my wife, I was into it about 6 months. I said, I'm going to have to stop this, or I'm going to have some kind of nervous breakdown or something. And so I actually decided to stop on July 4th, because that was a national holiday and everything. But one of the things that had happened, just to give you some idea of some other little vignettes there, I was at one grave one day, and there was a young woman sitting near it, and then I was sketching, and somebody had been recently buried, and then I didn't want to interfere with her process, and I was trying to be respectful, but at the very end I went over and just said, well, seems like you knew this guy, or, you know. And then she said, yeah, he was a doofus. He promised me he'd come back and he didn't. And I was like, whoa.
Yeah. Unexpected energy.
But anyway, as I was in the cemetery over time, there would be different holidays, and they have this tradition where people come out, I don't know who they are, and they put an American flag on every single grave in the cemetery. Mm-hmm. And the highest honor you can get in the military is a Medal of Honor. Okay.
Really? I thought it was a Purple Heart.
I think it's Medal of Honor. But anyway, they're probably on a similar level. But anyway, I didn't know anything about this, but I noticed that I began to research it, and then I found out there was a pamphlet that was at the information booth there at the cemetery that contained the names of the Medal of Honor winners that were buried in the cemetery.
Okay.
And I had wanted to get this pamphlet the whole time I'd been working on the project almost. And every time I'd go to this informational thing, it was usually on the weekend, it was closed. There was nobody there. Well, so July 4th, I go back for the very last time, and it's opened. Mm-hmm. It's on this top of a hill, and there's big flags around and everything, and all these graves around. And I walk in, and yeah, no problem. Here's the pamphlet, and I walk out the door, and I'm walking down the hill, and I'm reading names. There's about 13 or something buried in the cemetery, and I look down, and there's a gravestone, and it says Medal of Honor winner, and he's not in the pamphlet. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, oh, well, the least I owe this guy is to go back and tell him put his name in the pamphlet next time, right? So I walk back up. The place is closed. There's not a soul around. Mm. So I'm like, oh, man. And then so there's this administration building down the hill, and I thought, I'll go down there and tell them. Now, remember, this is the last day I'm going to be in the cemetery, right?
Yeah.
I walk down the hill. It's closed. I turn around, and this guy walks up to me, this African-American guy, and he says, and I'm not kidding you, he says, are you here to meet me? And I'm like, what? Uh-huh. And I was stuttering at the time because I didn't expect to meet anybody. And here's this guy
stranger.
Walks up and says, are you here to meet me?
Yeah.
And I said, well, why are you here? And he said, I'm here today to arrange for my friend who just died in Iraq. So that's the last person I met in the cemetery.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, this project was so fascinating because then I went on to do I only ever did one show of the entire project, but it was here in Santa Cruz, actually. And I wasn't living in Santa Cruz at the time. Mm-hmm. It was at the Loudon Center down here, and my friend Delana helped me arrange it.
Yeah.
And I had taken all these pictures of, which you can see on some of the blog too, mm-hmm. of different gravestones and different views in the cemetery and stuff. And we had reproduced those and we put them up with the sculptures and had the whole show out. And what was really fascinating was we had this naming session at this opening. And you remember I told you I went to work for this Committee for Nonviolent Action when I got out of college and did not get drafted. The Committee for Nonviolent Action had started in the Midwest at the nuclear silos, where protesters would nonviolently break through the gates and try to shut down these nuclear silos. Mm-hmm. And it had more recently moved to Voluntown, Connecticut, which is near the New London nuclear submarine base, to do protests there. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up being there for a year. Well, there were two key people who held that place together. One was Marge Swan and her husband Bob Swan. Okay, well, I left there after only about a year and went back to school and stuff, but I hadn't seen any of those people for, God, it's got to have been 30 years, okay? Mm-hmm. So we're doing this naming session, and all of a sudden, and by the way, it was called, the name of the piece ended up being called National Pastime.
Okay.
And it's kind of an interesting piece. We can maybe talk about it later. It's the piece that has the COVID virus in it.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
But at the time, I thought it was related to this war project,
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, in the back of the room, this old lady stands up, and she says, I'm Marge Swan, who I hadn't seen in 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, I want to tell you why I became a pacifist. She said, there was a lot of violence in my family, and I decided at a very early age I was not going to use violence to solve anything, and I was going to dedicate my life to nonviolence. Isn't that interesting? That would,
yeah.
I mean, is that synchronistic? I don't know. But anyway.
And she showed up to your show. Which
she
is based
came to
on
the
something
show. I
which
hadn't
is-
seen her in 30 years,
Yeah.
and stood up and told her story, which I didn't know, by the way.
Yeah.
So it was a very interesting experience. Not sure if that tells you everything about the Rosecrans Project, but that's pretty much it. We did talk about the one piece that got named, that's kind of the frontispiece for the project, which was based on how the city of Athens got named.
Poseidon. Poseidon's Epiphany.
Poseidon's Epiphany. Yeah, I don't know if you want me to talk a little more about that, but
That's connected. That's the final artwork after the Rosecrans, correct?
well, it was funny. I needed one more piece to put in the kiln with the last of the Rosecrans pieces, and this piece was there. I might have been done during or even after I did the Rosecrans pieces, but it was the first piece that got named at a session at my gallery in San Diego, and this young girl, I think she was 10 years old, stood up and she said, I think it looks like Poseidon. And so I had this book here on mythology, and I looked up the story, and it turned out to be the story of how the town of Athens was named, which was apparently a great competition between the gods, of which Poseidon and Athena were the main contenders. And so the gods said, create something that is of most worth to mankind, and you'll get the naming rights. And the other gods will be the judge, right? So Poseidon, kind of all full of himself, goes first, and I got this in the bag, and he's like, creates the war horse, the quintessential war animal at the time, and everybody just kind of stands back in awe, and they go, man, can't beat that one. And then Athena created the olive tree, and it's the symbol of peace and the food that feeds the people in the Middle East, and she got the naming rights.
Yeah.
And I thought how interesting that this was that first piece that was named, and that was the story, and the whole project was about how to get past war. It was too synchronistic for me. So anyway,
Everything
that's kind of the
goes full
story of
circle.
the project. Yeah.
Full circle.
Yeah.
I want to transition now into the art and physics book.
Okay.
And your connection to that, because I know you majored in art, but you minored in physics.
That's right. Yeah.
At the university that you went to.
Oh, it's a college, Kalamazoo College.
Kalamazoo College. And I was wondering if there were any surprising similarities between art, which is a liberal focus, and physics, which is a hard science. Were there any surprising similarities between those as you were studying them at the same time?
Well, I have always been interested in, as you can see from my original statement, the integration of intuitive and objective information, scientific and artistic. I was always interested in, I continue to feel that in order to survive, we are going to have to reintegrate those two, that they've gotten separated quite a bit since the Renaissance, but we are now being challenged to reintegrate intuition back into our intuitive way of dealing with the world. But with that said, there's a man named Leonard Shlain who is a writer. He's actually a neurologist who was up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he wrote this book that was called Art and Physics that I don't know who, a friend of mine introduced me to. And the theme of the book, which spoke to me, was that art predicted what science would later discover or verify by sometimes 25 to 100 years in advance. And he starts his book at the time of the Renaissance, and he goes into detail about the various artists and the various scientists working at that time, and pretty much, I felt, made a very good case for his premise.
Yeah.
One of the examples of that was there's a painter named Rene Magritte, who's a, I don't know, not exactly, kind of more like a Dali-esque type of painter. And so there's a surreal quality to his work. And he has this one painting that has a face on the back of a head. And it turns out that painting was painted 25 years before Einstein's theories of relativity did predict that if you were traveling at the speed of light, you could see somebody's face on the back of their head because the past and the present come together at that speed.
Oh, wow. So he drew a connection between that visual image and that scientific discovery.
That's what, Schlein did.
Okay.
Yeah, and so anyway, I was very influenced by that idea, and I continued to feel that that was the kind of connection I was looking for between the scientific and the intuitive, that we were not giving enough validity to the intuitive side of discovery, of solving our problems. And as a result, we were evolving a world which maybe solved a lot of problems, but might be creating more problems in the future. And we're now starting to see that with climate change and nutrient balance and all these things that we can create scientific solutions for, but then we haven't really thought it out for the next generation. Is what it comes down to. Yeah.
You were talking about the art and physics book, and then you actually were involved in a
when
project.
I got to Santa Cruz here, I heard about this project that a physicist at the university was putting together, where she was teaming artists and physicists, and the artists were to come up with artistic ways to portray the scientific investigations of the physicists. And so I thought, oh, this is for me, right?
Yeah.
And so I got teamed up with Heinrich Oldog over at the Stanford Linear Accelerator, of all places, the original accelerator. And he was doing research over there. And my idea for collaborating, because I was very influenced by the Schlein book, was I wanted to see what influence my doing artwork next to his scientific work might have on the result of his experimentation. So I went over and sketched in his lab for a week or two. And it was, actually I had to wear earphones at one point. It was very noisy and everything. And they were running this experiment, and I was doing these sketches, and then we had the show. And there was a couple of interesting things that came out of it. First, Heinrich became quite a fan of mine. I think he owns one of my pieces now. But the other thing was, I was asking him, later, what happened here, with the experiment? What were you experimenting about? And he said, well, we're experimenting with the speed of magnetism, and it's important because we store all our information on these magnetic disks on our computers, and they take a lot of energy. And at the time, they thought that, the fastest these waves could go was about 1 mile an hour, let's say. I don't know the exact. And then I said, well, what was the result? And he said, well, it appears if we do these certain things, the scientists are always hedging their bets because they got to do the experiment again. We can make them go 500 miles an hour.
Wow.
So I'm like, did I have an effect on it? I don't know.
Yeah.
But it was just interesting.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that was interesting about the project, and if you go and see some of the pieces on the project on my website, is that despite the fact that I was working in this environment, which was all metal and rectilinear and noisy, all of the images were very natural. They were in nature. They were trees. They were. They didn't have anything to do with that. It was, and I'm still kind of fascinated by that.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was a very interesting project, and in fact, one of the pieces blew up in the kiln because I had tried to dry it out too fast, and I was going to throw it away. And then my wife convinced me to pick up the pieces and glue them on a board, as we were trying to name them after different physicist theories at the time.
Okay.
And so we called it chaos theory.
Yeah, because it just exploded.
Yeah, and it was great. It was
Just
great.
like crumbles.
But anyway, that's the project that came out of that. It was pretty interesting. It's on my website.
And people can find out more and
Yeah,
see the
yeah.
actual works. It's on your website under the tab projects.
Yeah, and they can also see what other artists did for that project, which is still up on the website.
Fantastic. I wanted to transition now to the final, unless there was, I mean, I know you have so many projects over your artistic career, but the final big one, at least for me, in my mind, was the poetry project.
Yeah,
Is that true?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So you have this new book, Reflections, which is a collaboration between yourself and a poet.
Cheryl Latif.
Cheryl Latif. Mm-hmm. And she is just one of the poets. You actually collaborated with like a dozen or more poets.
Well,
correct?
about 25, I think, actually.
Okay.
And some of them were Hispanic and some of them were English writers.
Okay. Yeah.
And the idea behind the project, as I was saying earlier, I noticed that the work seemed to generate creativity. So what I did is I got these different poets together. A lot of them were, not all of them, but a lot of them were still students in the MFA program at San Diego State, but others were not. Some were from Mexico. And I invited them to pick pieces of mine at their choosing and write poems inspired by them. And so this was the original poetry project. And then we did an exhibit both at my gallery in San Diego and in Tijuana at the Tijuana Cultural Center that showed the poems and the works next to each other.
Right.
But I also did a similar project around the same time with musicians doing the same thing. But I never record those, so they're not really part of my website now. But I had always been interested from the very beginning in the idea of having a single musician or a single poet do a series of poems or a series of songs that were inspired by different works of mine, and then doing either an album or, in this case, a book that's come out of this. And nobody was ever interested in it. It was like 20 years or so.
Which is surprising because it's such a cool idea.
Well, it is, but I found that a lot of poets or musicians, they want to do their own thing. They don't want to
collaborate.
Yeah, I don't know why, but and in fact, this type of poetry now has a name. It's called ekphrastic poetry, which I don't think it even had at the time I was thinking about it. There's a whole website that's devoted to ekphrastic poetry now.
Which is poetry based on the visual art.
Inspired by visual arts.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I didn't even know about it until I got into this. But anyway, so 20 years later, I forget how I'm still got, Cheryl is on my list of people I'm communicating with, and I don't know how I got to talking with her about this, but I was like interested in some of the poetry she was writing, and I brought up this idea that I had that I'd always wanted to do this book, and then she said, "Oh, I'm interested."
Yeah.
And I thought, "Oh, great, I'm going to jump on board." And I thought, "Oh, this is going to take a couple of years to write like 10 poems, And so she cranks out 40 poems in 1 year.
Yeah.
And
Wow,
also,
that's
just talking about synchronistic, she has a friend who lives in San Diego who's a publisher, Jan Carpenter, who's basically donated a lot of her work so that this can happen. Mm-hmm. And she's the one who's put the whole book together that's going to come out this spring with 40 poems and 40 pictures of my work.
Yeah. No, it's really a really cool book to flip through. I was flipping through it last night. Mm-hmm. And funny enough, I looked, because just so people know, there's the book that they can order when it comes out this spring, and then there's also other poets that you collaborated with, and that's under the Poetry Project on your website. Yes,
on my website you can see a lot of the poems that were written on the website.
Yeah, and the poetry and the art is right there, and just to say, because I know you were curious about works that connected with me as someone who is a fan of your work, Listening to Life was one that really stood out. Past Forgotten, Future Told. Those two were ones that I really enjoyed. That's the
I think it's interesting. Those have since been sold to various people in San Diego. But,
I would imagine, because those two really stuck out to me as really good. But the one in the book of Cheryl's work was actually funny enough. You're gonna hear this and be like, well, he just chose the first one that he just flipped to the first page. He's like, I like that one. I actually flipped through the whole book. And I went back to it's literally the very first image, which is Joyful Imagination, which has this human-like figure that is just...
has a sort of a tree or something.
Grabbing its head, and just in my mind, I interpret it as like a proliferation of creative thought and imagery that is...
Well, this is a really interesting piece for a couple of reasons. First of all, that wasn't the original name of that piece. Cheryl came up with that name when she was writing the poem. And you'll notice some of the poems have different names than the pieces.
Yeah,
but
I noticed that.
This piece, interestingly enough, I'm pretty sure was originally from the Rosecrans series.
Really?
And I had associated it for many years with more of a depressing scenario. I even thought of it at one time as a guy screaming about climate change, all right?
Okay. Interesting.
And then when Cheryl started writing the poems, she said, I think I got a whole different take on this.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you noticed the timbre of her poems, but she's really positive, and a lot of the poetry is really uplifting, okay? And that's how she saw this piece. And it's called Joyful Imagination. And I had shown it before, and it was interesting. There wasn't a lot of interest in the depressing side of it from the name I had,
Yeah.
But I showed it at a show about a year and a half ago, and this woman came and just had to have it, and she was having this creative block. And she bought it and to inspire her.
Yeah.
And when Cheryl came up with the name, I just thought this is just perfect for this piece.
Yeah.
So anyway, kind of an interesting story.
No, that is a very interesting story. I did not know that it was part of the Rosecrans Project. And that it had that kind of negative association in your mind. At least that's really funny. Yeah, because I look at it and see positivity with the.
Well, the other thing that was interesting about the Rosecrans Project, which I didn't mention earlier, was for the most part, the imagery that came through it was very childlike and kind of innocent. And I was puzzled by that for quite a long time, but it occurred to me that it is a bit naive to use war as a way to solve human problems. It's a little bit of a childlike way of, well, you hit me, I'm going to hit you back.
Yeah.
And I think that's why the imagery was that way. I'm not quite sure. But it was interesting how, not all of it, but there's one piece in that series called Knight's Embrace, where there's a knight on a horse with a skeleton behind him, and it's kind of like what a soldier might be thinking just before he goes into war where he might be killed.
I noticed that one too. The skull is very eerily accurate to what I imagine death to be like. Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I think we're just going to wrap with a few kind of more fun miscellaneous questions.
All right.
If that's okay with you. We have like 15 minutes here on the clock. And I would like to wrap also with where people can find you online, your website. And I know you have a Flickr, which has maybe a more extensive archive of your work. But,
and I would like to mention, if they do sign up for the newsletter that I send out, that I do this thing called a Sculptor of the Month now that I started during COVID, where I go into a little more background and detail about maybe what was going on in my life when I created this, and or how it might be relevant to certain issues we are having in our time right now.
Okay. And how would people sign up for your newsletter?
Just go to my website and there's a sign-up block on there.
On the homepage? There's
Yeah,
somewhere you can put in your
on
email?
many pages actually. You can sign up on a bunch of places there.
Okay. Good to know. I wanted to ask, because I know you mentioned earlier that you had a dream journal, several dream journals, and your work is connected to Jungian psychology and the subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
What is your relationship to your dreams now, and has that changed over the arc of your artistic career with
well, I told you that
stuff?
my interpretation of what dreaming is has sort of changed earlier in the conversation, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I place less importance on dreaming now.
Okay.
I also meditate twice a day, and I find that meditative space often creates or comes up with creative solutions to things that are troubling me in perhaps a more straightforward way than dreaming might. But I think dreaming for me has become less important, and perhaps because of that I don't think the dreaming that I remember now is as complex as maybe it was earlier in my life.
I see.
I wake up more now, I'm older, and I wake up more during the night, and I often a dream will be there, and it is often kind of a little puzzling or even frightening, some of the things that come up. But I don't spend a lot of time, let's put it that way now, any longer trying to interpret dreams.
Yeah.
I'm sure they can be useful in some cases, but they haven't been that useful to me personally in the last few years. A lot of my sketch journals are interspersed with journaling, which I would do, and also writing down dreams for a while. But I didn't really use the journals as a way to interpret problems in my life and that sort of thing.
If you could choose one piece of art for everyone on Earth to be alone with in a room for an hour, from either your own work or just art in general, maybe you have an artist friend or from art history, what piece would you want people to kind of sit with?
Well, that's a hard one. It's interesting. I have these different pieces that my wife gets attached to, and she'll say, "Oh, you can't sell that one. I'm not done with it yet." And then a couple of years go by, and say, "Okay, you can sell that one now." And what it's been my belief is that different pieces speak to you at different points in your relationship with my art, and then it may be that they're working on you in a subconscious way, okay? And that then it's something you might need to hear, but you can't hear it. It's just happening because you're next to the artwork. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But then when it's worked itself through. So I would say it kind of varies somewhat. I was thinking when you spoke of this piece that I recently sold to a woman down in San Diego. It's called Voice of an Age. I don't know if you saw that on my website.
Did. Yeah.
And it's this nude woman with these kind of almost alphabetic symbols around her and stuff. And a lot of people would probably interpret that as, maybe sexist or sexual, or it's a man creating a woman's it's traditional, male artists do female nudes and that. But the reason I call that voice of an age is because it seems to speak to this whole transformation that's been going on during my generation of an increasing awareness of women, their value in the world, and their power to inform our culture in positive directions. And so to me, that's why it's the voice of an age. It's what we need to hear right now in that sense.
Yeah.
So that's one of the pieces that came to my mind. I vacillate back and forth between. It's funny. I used to do in my gallery down in San Diego. I would do these shows with other artists, and I would say, okay, you pick a piece of mine that you like, and I'll pick a piece of yours that I like, and then we'll do a show,
Yeah.
And I had this one piece. It's called Self-Abnegation. You know what that is, right?
No.
It's kind of like you putting yourself down,
Oh,
self-abnegation.
okay. Yeah.
And so this artist I was doing the show with, he picked that as his favorite piece of mine. And I thought, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. That could mean a lot of things about him or yourself.
I'm not sure where it was coming from.
Yeah.
But then sometimes I'll have other pieces that I don't even feel that attached to, but then somebody else will come around and they're just like all over it,
Yeah.
So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but
Oh, it sounds like voice of an age. I know that was a popular one, and that was one of the first that I noticed, even myself, looking through your works on.
yeah, and it was actually bought by my wife's ex kind of guru, yoga teacher, who's a woman in San Diego, runs a yoga practice there.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So I was very happy that she bought the piece.
Yeah.
I have another one that I think it was the one that got named down in Mexico. It's called The Day I Danced with Death.
Mm-hmm.
And for many years, I had this friend of mine who used to come to my shows, and he was an environmental consultant that I worked with. And he always would come, and he never would buy anything. And then he finally came to this one show, and he said, I want that piece. And he said, the reason is, he said, I've had this illness my whole life with my thyroid illness. And he said, this is totally my experience. The day I danced with death. He's been dancing with death his whole life.
Yeah.
And so I think they do speak to people individually on that level.
Yeah.
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 Anyway. All
Great.
right.
Well, Brad, thank you for taking the time to talk
you.
today, and
Yeah.
I really appreciate you inviting me into your space and allowing me to learn more about your life and your work. So
Yeah.
just to kind of wrap up, I know we touched on it briefly, but newsletter, people can just go to your website.
Yeah.
And
It's Burkhart-Sculptor.com.
Burkhart
Sculptor with an O-R.
Sculptor.
.com.
So that's in Burkhart's Burkhardt.
RT. That's right. Yeah.
All right, and they have the newsletter that you can sign up for there.
Yeah.
Anywhere else that you want people to know about you online, or is that?
They'll just find out about different shows I'm doing that way, and
That's right.
and I also invite people to come to my studio if they want to see work in person.
Oh, cool.
And
Nice.
they're welcome. They just need to give me a call or an email.
And you have a show coming up this spring, is that right?
Yeah, I have actually a preview show at the music school over in I think it's in Palo Alto for the Silicon Valley Open Studios. I have a piece in there. And then there is an open studio show in May where I'll be with 9 other artists over in the Los Altos Hills area.
Okay. Fantastic.
So,
and that information on that's on your website?
It will be, but if you're on the newsletter, you'll get the information.
Okay.
Yeah, and then, as I say, I do the Sculptor of the Month. Every month I do a new piece.
Nice.
So.
Cool. Well, fantastic, Brad. Thank you so much again.
Okay. Thank
All
you
right.
for being interested. All right. Well, so you want to take a little break, have a cup of tea, and then head into the studio?
Sounds good.